Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to episode 5 of Lift HV Remote Roundtable from Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress. A new episode of this remote roundtable is available every Wednesday at noon, featuring conversations surrounding professional development, leadership, communication, and connection. I'm Kate Stryker, a research planner with Pattern for Progress. I will be moderating today's panel discussion about civic engagement during COVID-19. How to stay active and informed in your community during pause. Joining me today are Anne Sullivan, the Hudson Valley Civic Engagement Coordinator for the New York Civic Engagement Table. She brought together organizations to identify regional needs to increase civic engagement, has held civic engagement and skills trainings for low-income Black and immigrant residents, put together census briefings and interactive community trainings with presentations by the Census Bureau and New York State Governor's Office, and engaged a range of organizations to hold nonpartisan candidate forums in Poughkeepsie and Newburgh. Anne has been a consultant and acted as an interim executive director of the New York Communities Organizing Fund, Incorporated, after leading fundraising efforts for community organizing initiatives over nearly 20 years that raised millions of dollars. As a lead organizer for New York Acorn and then deputy director with New York Communities for Change, Anne organized anti-housing discrimination campaigns, exposing institutionalized racial discrimination, pioneered a successful effort to rid public schools of toxic PCBs, built a membership base and developed organizing staff and interns in New York City and on Long Island, and coordinated a campaign for long-term affordability at the Starrett City in Brooklyn. Anne holds an MFA from New York University and a BA from Sarah Lawrence College. We also have with us today Dr. Melissa Gaeke, Director of the Center for Civic Engagement and Leadership and Professional Lecturer in Political Science at Marist College. Melissa is a doctorate in Public Administration from the University of Southern California's Sol Prince School of Public Policy. Her interests include engaging students in activities that teach them about civic engagement and working with nonprofit organizations to build their capacity to access resources and connect with stakeholders. Prior to arriving at Marist in the fall of 2014, Melissa was the executive director of academic partnerships from 2010 to 2014 at the University of Southern California. In that role, she created and supported partnerships between USC's civic engagement programs, the research of the university's academic units, and community stakeholders. From 2003 to 2010, Melissa served as the director of the USC Volunteer Center, where she was responsible for implementing a variety of community service and community-based learning programs for undergraduate students. Melissa began her career in New York City, where she held a variety of leadership positions at the Jacob Riis Neighborhood Settlement, a mid-sized social service agency in Queens, New York, from 1994 to 1999. Thank you both for being with us today. So to start off, I'm interested to hear from each of you about what civic engagement means to you and the work you do. And Anne, if you don't mind, go ahead and starting with that question.
Sure. So the New York Civic Engagement Table works to build power in communities of color, immigrants, poor, and working people. And so for us, civic engagement is kind of a range of things. Often for us, it starts with actually getting registered to vote, nonpartisan voter registration, and getting out to vote, also nonpartisan, but also includes supporting the work of people standing up, speaking out in their communities. Right now, critically filling out the census form to actually be counted and have their communities counted in this world, and maybe running for office in the long run. So everything along that trajectory.
Okay, thank you, Anne. I'm going to go now to Melissa, if you don't mind answering the same question.
Great. Well, I think that very similar kind of ideas as to what Anne just shared, that civic engagement in the context of a college community really is not only supporting the work of our community partners and assisting in furthering the community building and actions that they've identified as necessary and important, but it's also about building the awareness and the dispositions of students to really pay attention to the things that matter, and it's important to also help those students kind of figure out what they care about, and to recognize how things are interrelated. So a lot of the education around raising awareness and understanding values, I think, is an important component of civic engagement. So it's both the attention to important matters and it's the activity taken to make change in whatever facets that are needed.
I just wanted to say, I think what you just said about paying attention to what matters is so important. It reminded me that the other part of that is making sure that information actually gets out to communities
Mm-hmm.
that's not always so readily available, right? And where do you go to look for it, and how do you get that information out to communities becomes critical.
Following up with you, Melissa, you mentioned that one of the jobs or one of the goals is sort of to build awareness and just help students identify what their interests are. And can you just talk a little bit more about that? Is that a matter of making information accessible to them, or sort of what kind of programs or activities achieve that?
Yeah. Well, in community-based learning, we think of it as a reflective exercise, and it's that practice of taking what students experience and having them think about the so what of that. So it could just become a reporting, I did this, and then I did that, and then I did this. And without that reflective component of why did it matter? What was interesting? What did you observe? How does that relate to something else? Maybe it's something else in their course of study, or maybe it's some value or experience they've had in their past, or maybe it's all of those things. And we find that at least I've found, in my faculty colleagues who've been doing this at Marist have found that it's that kind of continued reflective practice that helps students really identify that for themselves. And it is about that self-discovery that I think is so important. And then that stimulates their interest and curiosity to do more of that. So it's just facilitating that inquiry and self-discovery.
And I guess we could start with Anne again on this one. What impact, in your experience, in your just professional opinion, does a high level of civic engagement have on a community and on an individual?
I feel like all of us, when we feel like we can be heard and our voices are heard and then acted on, uh, I think we all feel much more powerful and healthy and able to have a positive impact on our own lives as well as on the community. When people come together in a community and work for some change that's important, number one, that change is coming from the community. It's coming from people who are most affected. The idea of how to get that change, what kind of change is needed, is coming from the community. And then I think it's much more likely to actually solve the problem or improve the community. Um, and then the whole community ends up being a much better and stronger community. And then often, I think there's a third part of that, which is um, people also create community by working together, by coming together and saying, we're going to register 1,000 people in our community. And then doing it and then celebrating that, and are ready to fight for the next change, whether it's around um, affordable housing, whether it's around fair and just policing, which is just so critical right now, whether it's around making sure that the community gets its fair share of resources, or whether it's making sure that jobs in the community. Jobs in the area are actually, people in the community are actually able to get those jobs, or immigrants are able to get driver's licenses, etc.
Since your work is sort of focused on campus primarily, can you sort of tailor the same question to that setting?
I can, and really the ideas again that I love following you, Anne, because it's really, it is about community, and I think when students come together and I just work to define problems or even just share experiences, it does build that community, and then it allows students to think about, well, what can we do, and inevitably someone's had an experience of something that worked, and then they can they try it out, and we see a lot of that problem solving on campus, and there is a social element to civic engagement. I think that one of the challenges to civic engagement work, and one that has a high level of impact, is when it happens in isolation, and I don't think that it is as effective if it's just kind of isolated from either the decision maker and the where you can see real impact. And that was the other idea that I heard, and in your comment, is that it's one thing to have this sort of engaged community who's fired up and kind of thinking creatively about solutions, but if it's not received by actors who can actually do something with those ideas, and it's not this exchange, and where that exchange has real meaning, to just be listened to but not have any real, it didn't do anything, is not going to continue to build community. Maybe it will, but so I think for students, being able to really have that first experience that we came together, we found something that mattered, someone listened to us, and it resulted in something, is what will cement their belief that this works. And I think as faculty and as other members of a college community, really facilitating that process and helping students sort of navigate that and make sense of it is a really important learning opportunity.
So I'm going to stick with you, Melissa, on this one, and then we'll follow with Anne. I'm switching things up a bit. So the topic of today's discussion is really focused on this moment right now. As we all know, we are having this remote discussion because of the unfortunate situation of the pandemic. And I'd like to hear from each of you, starting with Melissa, about why is civic engagement important right now? Sort of what's on the table, what's going on. And then a follow-up to that is, do we have public discourse? And if yes, why, what's working? And if not, sort of what could be improved upon?
I absolutely think that civic engagement is really critical right now. And we can't address the widespread public health crisis that we're facing without sustained civic engagement. And I think part of what I've been struck by in this period of being on pause is how reliant we are on each other, seeing our fates tied up with one another. That, the fact that we are willing to stay at home or wear a mask or be socially distant means that we see our actions as affecting each other. And I think that's kind of a fundamental belief that for me is what's underneath civic engagement. We have to believe that there's a collective impact that's possible, and that we're each willing to do what we can. And so I also think that that's going to assist in the kind of mitigation of a problem like what we're facing. But I also think that there's an opportunity in civic engagement to really think about the solutions. And there's so much talk about the new normal and what will this look like. And I think that we probably will find a whole new set of ways of interacting and being with each other that might mean real change and real difference in the way we access resources or the way decisions get made. I mean, if you think about just the question about how we vote, like what will that look like, and what do we all think about voting by mail or not voting by mail, and how do we want to weigh in on critical decisions about these things. And so I do think that it's, if no other time, this is the time to really think about how we come together and stimulate real conversation that results in solutions to problems that we all experience. And I do think that that's different than maybe other things, because unlike other problems in the community, sometimes it doesn't affect you directly. And I think the pandemic is affecting all of us in ways that for some, you can't ignore it. And so that is going to foster more interest in what do we do about it. And your second question about public discourse, for me, when I think about discourse, it's about dialogue. And dialogue requires two willing actors to come together and listen as much as you speak. And I'm not sure that we have as much dialogue and discourse that is really equally listening as speaking. So I would love to see more dialogue and discourse that is respectful and collaborative, if that makes sense. Engaged.
Just want to let Anne talk to the same question. So why is civic engagement important at a time like now? And do we have public discourse in this moment?
In many ways, civic engagement is more critical than ever right now because Melissa talked about opportunities. There are opportunities for change right now, and there are decisions being made about our lives, about voting, for example. Some of those are really exciting opportunities. New York's voting laws, some of us think have needed changing for a long time. And some of those changes are now like voting by mail, like you can now call into the Board of Elections and say, I need to vote by absentee ballot, and they'll actually send you the absentee ballot application. It's still two steps. But so there are some things that we've got an opportunity to change in a really good way if we are involved, and that will make our lives and our communities much more small d democratic in the long run, right? But of course, the reverse is true. There could be some decisions made that'll affect us for a long time that could really hurt communities for a long time. I think about back to voting. I think about voter registration. How do you do voter registration right now? If you've got a driver's license, okay, you can register to vote, but it's tricky in New York, right? And for us, in numbers, the voter registrations we did, particularly in Newburgh and Poughkeepsie, a lot of that was done by individuals from the community talking to their neighbors on the street, and having a paper form right there to fill out, right? And so now with this, what changes do we have an opportunity to make with our voter registration? How we do voter registration in New York State? The census is another way. I mean, the census data. If we are all counted, right? If we are all counted, then that data is used to ensure we get our fair share of resources, whether it's Medicaid, Medicare, whether it's highway, street paving money, whether it's Head Start, school lunches, affordable housing money, so many programs. And that's going on right now. They've extended the deadline till the end of October, but this is a time that if we aren't counted, again, that data is used for the next 10 years. And we have a really high chance of not getting our fair share of resources for the next 10 years if we aren't active civically now. And then do we have public discourse? Hard to see it, right? The state is being run right now, looks to me like by executive order, right? Though not very much legislating is going on. Some city council meetings are meeting by Zoom and the community can watch, but there's no way to publicly comment. You got to send your public comments in writing several days ahead of time, right? And then those comments, if somebody's really diligent, might you might be able to read them if you follow up 5 days later and remember to do that, right? But it's just not the same level of discourse. So yeah, I think it's tricky right now to figure out how to be heard and how to affect um, decisions that are being made.
So to follow up on that, what just specifically with voter registration, with the census participation, and with just local municipal discourse, what are some, if you have any concrete ideas for how we can make those programs more successful? Either of you can jump in on this.
One of the things as I was listening, and it reminds me that what's needed are responsive institutions. So while you have city councils or town councils or boards of supervisors working remotely, there's a need for those bodies to be even more responsive and engaged. And it's not, it doesn't, how do you, how do they facilitate meaningful civic engagement, knowing that the individuals who might have attended in person and stood and made their comment is an important part of the process. And so, I would hope that there are members of those bodies who are saying, is there something else we can do? Is there a way that we can stimulate that involvement and that really feels genuine and meaningful? So I don't know. I mean, I feel hopeful, and this is maybe the optimist in me, that what's revealed in this are real interest, very interesting examples of new and innovative ways to have citizen participation in the kind of pre-existing democratic processes, like a city council meeting. I think that would be really fascinating to watch and see. And I hope that there's more kind of creative thinking in doing some of that. Because if there isn't, then I feel that over time, if this is sustained, this kind of new normal, you probably would see an erosion of civic engagement. And it's only the very diligent kind of, we've all been to those meetings, city council meetings, where it's the person who sits in the front row, who's known on a first name basis by everyone involved, that never misses a meeting. Those individuals will continue to participate. But what about others if we don't have creative solutions? So I wish I had a great idea. I'm hoping Anne might.
Right, Anne, do you have any?
I mean, I think it's what we're all struggling with right now, right? I mean, I think lots of people are trying different things. I think, like you just said, and there's some more people that I hope will try more different things or think about it more. But you see the protests now that are car protests. People are having big 150, 500 person Zoom calls and Zoom meetings to take action together and to bring elected officials into those spaces to hear the voices. But I think that's right. I don't know that anybody's got a silver bullet right now. Um, Even simple things like how do you talk to everybody in the community? Because especially in low income communities, not everybody has phone service. Not everybody has internet access. Certainly not everybody has a computer. Um, and even if people do have phones, how many times in the last year have those phone numbers changed, right? So how do we organize in a way that we actually reach people who are the hardest to reach and the least engaged? You can't go even knock on doors. That doesn't get to everybody. Um, so it's interesting, there are some new programs that there's one called Empower that allows you to talk to somebody who says, "Yeah, I want to do something about that," and allows them to engage all of their networks and allows them to pass it on for somebody else to engage their networks. So there are some things that we're trying. Um, but it feels very distant to write a comment, send it off, never have it read, never see it again, never hear a response to it. It's tough.
To what Anne is saying. And it's that feedback loop that I think is so critical, that in order to feel, a sense of efficacy, like it matters and that my voice was heard, you have to see a tangible expression of that. And that is what I feel concerned about, that if you just send it off and you never even see like how many comments were received, how many comments were read, how many were addressed, like, so at minimum you'd need to have some sort of data dashboard, because some organization would start to pay attention to those dashboards and start amplifying and promoting, like, did you know that only 1% of comments were addressed? Then that's a very specific thing to start organizing around, to like get more of those comments read and addressed. And so I think that more information is going to be necessary in order to do this well. And so someone has to collect it and then make it available to people. And so I feel like we're going to find, I hope we find some really innovative ways to capture that information and share it back. And the real time kind of dimension of all of this is also going to be maybe an opportunity, but also a challenge when you've got so many different things moving at the same time. So I just thought that was interesting, Anne, what you were just saying, and it made me think about information sharing.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and you made me think about one other aspect of it, which is um, it- what I see, particularly looking at the city of Newburgh, is that Facebook has been a place where people go back and forth, right? And some of the city council are very active on it. But looking back at people's responses, you don't always know where they're coming from. And I don't just mean, okay, they just live in the city of Newburgh, right? Or maybe they work in the city of Newburgh but live outside the New. But how many comments are coming from Texas and Wyoming and Michigan and Florida? And I think about this really in the context of race, right? Because as a majority Black and Brown community, um, when you're getting white, and I will say racist comments coming from other places, and yet are those comments also equally influencing the city council? I think it's something we have to be really aware of and really careful of, and think about how do we actually take in and respond and listen to the community that we're serving. Right?
Really interesting point.
A really important, I know one of our other topics on the table is social media and the impacts it has. And I think Anne just laid out for us the danger in social media. If we just think, it's a wonderful connector, but it can also warp, maybe is a different way of thinking, that if you just say, oh, we are having all of this feedback, and the feedback is one-sided or very narrow and not even reflective of the place that we're working in, how do you trust that you're being informed in ways that gives you a clear picture? So as a decision maker, I would be very cautious about my reliance on a very narrow segment of opinions, and I would want to see a lot of diligence in vetting ideas. If I'm just reliant on one source, I mean, and I think that's the reality in this modern context, not even COVID context, but just 24-hour news cycle with social media, that, I mean, we have to be so discerning of information. And I think as decision makers, I feel like it's a reasonable expectation to hold them accountable for getting their information and being very discerning and not limiting to just one narrow strand. That I expect decision makers to have full as possible and as complete and reflective as possible. That then helps me trust that they're keeping the public's interest top of mind. So it would worry me to see that go unchecked.
So backing off a little bit, just sort of to the pre-COVID setting of civic engagement, I'm wondering if either of you or both of you can talk a little bit about what are effective strategies to communicate with policymakers and leaders, and what, and then we can maybe sort of go from there and pivot towards the new normal.
Sure. And I'm going to say something that I apologize if it's just super obvious, but the first thing is just making sure we're identifying the right decision maker, right? Who has actually got the power to make decision on whatever that issue is. And then what affects decision makers really depends on who that person is, and whether it is 100 people showing up at a city council meeting will actually affect that city council. Whether it is in particular key leaders in the community that that elected official listens to, or that civic body that's making the decisions listens to, whether it is the clergy in a community, whether it is the business community. I think part of it is really analyzing who's making the decision and who they listen to, and then how to influence them effectively. So, being in person, in some places, letters to the editor in the local newspapers, elected officials often read them, or their staff really reads those local papers. Sometimes it's getting a lot of live phone calls into an office. I think in the past, emails to me have not been as effective, but I've heard that elected officials, count how many they get on either side. So I think a lot of it is, and then there's the power of the vote, right, to send a message.
I completely agree with Anne in knowing who is in front of you and knowing what their kind of, if it's possible to know what their preferences or their agenda is, and kind of tailoring the request, or providing information that helps kind of maybe find the mutual benefit, which maybe sounds a little idealistic, that we can get to a mutually beneficial outcome But I think we also have to recognize the kind of constraints that these decision maker faces, and finding a solution that could be accounting for both of our interests. And I think that some of that does require a relationship. So having a trusting relationship with that decision maker that would allow for that exchange of ideas and maybe compromise is going to get a more sustainable decision than one where it may be more adversarial, right? And I think not all circumstances or issues were, some are really the only way to get change is through kind of a adversarial kind of challenge, and other issues could benefit and maybe lend themselves to a more collaborative, engaged process. And so not all issues are the same, and I don't think all strategies will fit each in the same way.
Sort of following up on what Anne said, and you sort of echoed, Dr. Gaeke, the sort of first step. So I'm just imagining somebody who hasn't really been that engaged before, and they're really concerned about something that's happening in their community. How do they figure out who to target? How do they figure out who's the person they really need to be contacting?
In terms of first step, I would think is finding out if my neighbors, if my friends, if there are other people in my community who are like-minded, right? Because if I'm the only person in the whole community who wants this change, I'm not sure it's likely. So I think that's really the first step, right? Finding out who cares about this, bring them together, bring folks together to say, and then to ask that question. Okay, who has the power to make this change? Because asking each other, someone may know, but figuring out, okay, what's the research to be done, and whether that's research online or making a phone call or going to City Hall. Who owns? I spend a lot of time doing research on landlords, and what do you go down to the county records office? Some counties you can just go online and look up who the property owner is, and what other properties they own. And in some cases, you need to go talk to the tenants and find out they actually know other addresses that the landlord owns. So I think there are a variety of ways to do that research, but I bet Melissa has lots of good research ideas.
Well, thank you, Anne. I actually think Kate, when you asked that question, what immediately came to mind is what's needed are organizations like Anne's, who provide the capacity for individuals to do some of that work. And it might be individuals like Anne, you know, because you've done it. And so you need folks who have the experience to break through the red tape of where do you go, how do you get the information? Once you have the information, what do you do with it? And I think that capacity building organizations, which might be community organizing organizations that help individuals build the capacity and their skill set to identify those issues and do the work, are important. I also think other kind of organizations that have the relationships. And so, for me, civic engagement is not, it doesn't happen in isolation. And I think if we see it as this sort of interconnected network of people, then you can fill in the gaps, because for that individual who just is like, something's got to be done, right? They need to have an outlet, and it may be talking to their neighbors. I completely agree with Anne that that's the first step, is finding out who else cares. And I do think that's where, if we circle back to the idea of social media can help people find those like-minded other people who care about that same issue. And it does create community and gives people a sense of what's possible. And then it's the so what of, well, what are we going to do here? So what does that look like in Newburgh? What does that look like in Poughkeepsie? Okay, and now who else is doing this work? And so there's a lot of relationship building that comes with civic engagement. And I think sometimes people are really good at relationship building, and sometimes you need some help in having that person who puts people together. Those matchmakers, I think, are really essential individuals. You know, maybe they're not the ones to be doing the back end research of what is our best possible strategy. Like, what do we, the sort of strategic thinkers, the relationship builders. There's so many different roles individuals can play in civic engagement work, that it sometimes is overwhelming for. I think it can be overwhelming. Like, how are we going to do this? Because you don't know where to start. But having people who can help lay it out for you and get you connected, I think is helpful.
I'm just so glad you brought up organizations, because if you're looking at housing, first organization I would go to is Community Voices Heard, maybe. And if you're looking at immigrant rights and driver's license, I might call Nobody Leaves Me in Hudson. I mean, there are a lot of organizations, like you said, that have done a lot of work on issues, and so depending on the issue, there's a lot of work and expertise and an automatic base for you and your neighbors and friends to actually join and make that a more powerful voice and a better chance of winning that change.
This is a question catered to many of our listeners who are young entrepreneurs. And I'm wondering if either of you have anything to say about how local businesses in a community benefit from civic engagement?
So I think it's an interesting point, and for me, community really is all of us. Small businesses have an important play an important role in a community, and there, I think we're seeing the kind of interdependence that not only just from consumers or people who come in and take advantage of whatever they are offering, and so it's not either or, but it's both and. So they're reliant on individuals coming in and patronizing their business. They're also, businesses that have employees, and so their decisions affect. So you can't get away from civic engagement when you're a small business owner, and being at the table to think about how do we operate safely for both our consumers or customers and our staff, and how do we create and continue to contribute to a vibrant economy. And what does that mean in the short term? What does that mean in the long term? So I would hope that small business, it's very hard. I think there's additional pressures on small business owners, and I would hope that there would be many opportunities for them to participate in decisions that are made at all different levels of government.
I think that's right, and I think that small businesses, they're businesses in the community, so they help the community thrive, but they also need the whole community to thrive, right? They need the whole community to have decent jobs so they can come in and actually purchase what they need to purchase or buy food or whatever it is. The one thing I'll add is around census, because right now the census response rate in a community is so critical to especially low-income communities of color that have been traditionally had very low census response rates, right? Small businesses need the community to have all the resources it deserves, its fair share of resources. And so they will do so much better if the entire community is civically engaged. And in this particular case, if everybody in the community fills out their census form.
All right, so this is sort of the final question. If you guys have any concluding remarks. I think this has been a really interesting conversation about the challenges of the moment. What strikes me in particular is what's going to last from this moment going forward, and how we can really sort of go forward with some positive changes, but also need to be really wary of what negative things could come about from the moment if we are not engaged in what's happening. So is there any way that you would suggest our listeners be engaged at the moment, and what can they do? Just sort of like a call to action for the listeners.
My first reaction to your question, Kate, was it's hard to pay attention to all things equally. So I would really encourage your listeners to just find the one thing that matters most, the thing that you keep coming back to. Maybe it's about a certain aspect of community life that really matters most. So maybe it's education, or maybe it's food insecurity. If you keep attending to the stories about people providing resources, like I'm really touched by as hard as things have been, people still are helping their neighbors, delivering meals and making masks for healthcare workers. And, so finding the promise in this moment is something that I think about. So I'm really motivated to feel and see the things that are contributing. And so I would really encourage finding the one thing that feels like it makes sense, and then pay attention to that, and to find out sort of what we've been saying all, throughout this conversation today. Who else sees the world in a similar way, or who else is kind of talking about things that are consistent with those ideas, and just start there. You don't have to do things in all ways with the same kind of energy, but do one thing and find those people who are doing that same work or talking in a similar way, and don't think that you have to do it. You're not going to make change overnight, and that I think the best change happens incrementally.
I think that those were good words for all of us to hear and remember. I'll just add to that, which is I think there are so many ways for people to contribute. A company donated about 30 laptops to us that we thought we were going to use to help people do the census, and now we're social distance, so it's going to change a little bit. But we have a wonderful volunteer who is actually upgrading all of those laptops for us, right, so that people can use them. And now, in some ways, they're needed in a slightly different way, as people who want to get involved don't have access to computers at home. We're able to loan those out to people. But whether people are just willing to do phone calls, whatever the issue is that they care about, there are places for people to do phone calls, or do Facebook, or do Instagram, or whatever interest, whatever skill people have, I think there is absolutely a way for them to be involved, and a need for them to be involved. And of course, fill out your census form.
And I think that was, Anne, you said it so beautifully, that, things will happen. Yeah, we have to believe that that's possible, and just starting somewhere. So Anne, you really said that so beautifully. So that I just want to acknowledge you.
Hopefully our listeners feel inspired to be engaged. I want to thank you both for participating in this discussion today. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in to this remote roundtable. And considering the topic of this roundtable, I want to end it with this sort of call to action that please, if you have not yet, fill out your census, as Anne mentioned, and of course, always vote. Okay, thank you very much.